All right, let's dive in. Today, we are talking about a war that was, believe it or not, incredibly short. But its impact? Whoa. It completely changed America's role on the world stage. We're talking about the Spanish-American War of 1898.
So get this. The entire war, from start to finish, lasted just 4 months, April to August, 1898. I mean, you could have blinked and missed the whole thing. But the changes it brought about, well, those were forever.
And that's really the big question we're going to tackle here. How on earth did such a short, seemingly simple conflict manage to launch the United States as a global empire? And how did it create a huge constitutional mess that, we're still dealing with today? So here's how we're going to break it down. We'll start with how the nation was transformed, then look at what was pushing it toward empire in the first place. We'll see the spark that lit the fuse, how an empire was born practically overnight, the steep price of that power, and finally, the wild new legal reality America had to invent for itself. Okay, so this war, this is the moment. This is when the United States basically stood up and said, okay, our time of staying out of world affairs is officially over. It was a huge, deliberate step onto the world stage, and once they took it, there was really no going back.
But here's the thing you gotta understand. This didn't just happen out of the blue. The war was more like the final straw, the tipping point. There were these powerful forces, economic, ideological, that had been building up inside the U.S. for decades, pushing the country toward this moment long before a single shot was ever fired. So what were those forces? What exactly created this tinderbox where a war for expansion started to seem not just like an option, but for a lot of people, a flat-out necessity?
Well, it really boils down to three big pressures. First, American factories were just pumping out so much stuff, and industrialists were getting desperate for new places to sell it all. Second, there was this idea that the American West, the frontier, was now closed. This created this kind of psychological need to find new horizons elsewhere. And third, a really influential new naval strategy was basically giving everyone a roadmap for how to do it. And that roadmap came from a guy named Alfred Thayer Mahan. His argument was simple. If you want to be a great nation, you need a great navy. And that didn't just mean having modern steel ships. No, you needed a whole network of naval bases and coaling stations all around the globe to project your power. Mahan's ideas basically turned expansion from a vague idea into a strategic to-do list. So you've got all this pressure building and building. All it needs is a spark. And that spark was about to be provided by a powerful new player in American life, the mass media newspaper. See, at the time, you had these two newspaper giants, Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, and they were in this nasty fight for readers. To sell papers, they used something we now call yellow journalism, just wild, sensational, often totally made-up stories about how awful the Spanish were being in Cuba. Their goal wasn't to report the facts, it was to stir up public anger to move more papers. This quote, which is famously connected to Hearst, just says it all. Apparently, when his artist in Cuba told him things were pretty quiet, Hearst shot back a telegram that said, "You furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war." He knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't just covering a story, he was trying to create one. And this timeline just shows you how fast that outrage turned into actual war. February 15th, the USS Maine blows up. The very next day, the headlines are screaming, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain," blaming Spain with zero proof. The public pressure was just insane, and barely 2 months later, America was officially at war. The war itself, it was over in a flash. The modern American Navy just demolished the old Spanish fleets. But the peace treaty that came after, well, that wasn't so much about peace as it was about grabbing territory. John Hay, who was the U.S. ambassador to the UK, famously called it a splendid little war. And you can kind of see why, from his point of view. It was short, not a lot of American combat deaths, and the stuff the U.S. got out of it was just unbelievable. Yeah, the Treaty of Paris was less of a negotiation and more like an imperial shopping trip. Cuba got its independence, but with a major catch. The U.S. could intervene whenever it wanted. Puerto Rico and Guam were just handed over. And then there were the Philippines, seen as the key to Asia, which the U.S. bought for $20 million. Just like that, America had a global empire. But that empire came with a very, very high price. Getting the Philippines, especially, threw the United States right into another, much uglier war, and it kicked off this huge moral crisis back home. The Filipino nationalists, who had actually fought with the Americans against Spain, felt totally betrayed. They thought they were getting freedom, not just swapping one colonial ruler for another. What followed was the Filipino-American War, a nasty guerrilla conflict with tons of casualties. It got so bad that famous Americans like Mark Twain started the Anti-Imperialist League to fight against what the US was doing. And this was the fundamental question they were asking. How could a country that was founded on the ideals of freedom and self-government turn around and rule over other people without their permission? I mean, can a republic even be an empire without completely betraying what it stands for? This whole moral problem was also a massive legal problem. The US Constitution just wasn't built for this. America had never had these huge overseas territories filled with people who weren't expected to become citizens. They literally had to make up a new set of rules as they went along. And the whole legal debate boiled down to this one simple question: does the Constitution follow the flag? In other words, if the US plants its flag in Puerto Rico or the Philippines, do the people living there instantly get all the rights of an American citizen? The Supreme Court, in a series of really controversial rulings called the Insular Cases, basically said, no, the full Constitution does not automatically follow the flag. It was a decision that essentially gave the US the legal green light to run an empire. What the court did was create this brand new legal category out of thin air, the unincorporated territory. And what that meant was that Congress got to pick and choose which constitutional rights applied to the people living in these places. It was a legal workaround, a system invented specifically to let America have colonies without having to offer them statehood or full citizenship. And that brings us all the way to today, because that legal framework, cooked up over 100 years ago to solve this problem of empire, still shapes the lives and the rights of millions of people in places like Puerto Rico, Guam, and American Samoa. And it leaves us with this powerful, nagging question that started with that splendid little war. Who exactly gets to be a full American?